Okay, now that we've got our shiny new project to work with, let's take a look at what's inside it, and we're going to strip any of the demo code that's provided with the template away and simplify things and get it down to its bare bones, the minimum we need to run a web API type of project inside .NET. So let's start off at the top, and each project comes with its own project file, and this includes settings for the project as well as any packages that are installed or any references to any other projects. And it tells us which is the target framework it's going to use, .NET 7 in this case, and that's the current stable version of .NET at the time of recording. And Microsoft releases a new version of the .NET framework, or a new major version of the .NET framework, every November. So if you're watching this in November, then .NET 8 could well be released. And I've taken a look at what's coming up for .NET 8, and there's no breaking changes between what we're doing here for .NET 7 and what's coming up in .NET 8. So if .NET 8 is released, then please feel free to use that. That will work just fine. But I would not recommend using a preview or pre-released version of .NET 8 for what we're doing, because that may give you problems later on. I would recommend just sticking with the stable released versions of .NET. Also in here, we've got this flag for nullable. Now what is this one doing? Well, typically in the .NET world, strings are nullable. And if we do not provide a value for a string, that's fine, because they are considered nullable properties. But if we go to this example class, this weather forecast, then we can see that they've got a property called summary. And it's got the question mark here, which means this is explicitly set to be optional, just like a normal string would be treated. But if we take away the question mark, then we get a warning here saying that the non-nullable property summary must contain a non-null value when exiting constructor. So this nullable property, I'm not a big fan, and I prefer strings to operate how they always used to do, whereas we can declare the property without explicitly saying it's optional, because it is just optional. So what I like to do, and what I would recommend you do, is you disable this flag for nullable and set it to disabled. And what we'll find then is that inside this weather forecast class, now we don't have the warning, and the summary property here is optional, just as it always has been. And that's the way I'm going to build these services, and that's how I'm going to expect the strings to work. So please do turn that off in your project as well. The implicit usings is helpful. I'm going to leave that enabled. It's useful, and it removes the amount of boilerplate in our code. Because if we take a look at, we don't have much code to work with here, but I'll go for an example and pick the weather forecast controller in this case. We have a single using statement at the top here, and that's because we're using something in here that comes from a different namespace in the framework. Now if we were to disable implicit usings, for example, and I'll do the same here, then what we'll find is that we start to see errors in our application. And if I go back to the weather forecast controller, we can see that we've got a number of different errors because we would then need to explicitly import the different using statements for the things that are being used inside this class. So for example, the IEnumerable, if I click my mouse cursor inside where the error is, then it tells us that we're missing a namespace. And if we use the light bulb on the left, then it tells us this is coming from system collections generic. Now if we disable implicit usings, then we need to explicitly add using statements for some of the commonly used namespaces in the framework. Obviously that's going to then increase the boilerplate in our code, because now we've got extra using statements. So what I'm suggesting is that we want to leave implicit usings on, and I'm going to keep this as enabled. It's a handy new feature that came out with .NET 6 that is very useful. We've also got a couple of packages that Microsoft have deemed necessary to add to the template for the web API, but I'm actually going to remove these because Swashbuckle ASP.NET Core is for Swagger. It is a useful tool, but it will add noise inside our application, and we're going to use a different tool for testing our API endpoints, and we're not going to use Swagger to do so. We're going to use a tool called Postman. So I'm going to remove the extra noise in the application and any extra boilerplate for code that we're not actually going to be using, and that includes Swagger. So that's now gone. And let's work our way down to see what else we have in this project and things that we can change or improve. If I go into this properties folder, we've got some settings to deal with how our application runs when we either hit the play button or we use .NET Run or .NET Watch Run from the command line. Now we've got a whole bunch of different profiles in here about which API URLs or which URLs our application is going to be launched on. If it's going to launch the URL in a browser at the same time when we start our application. We've got a profile for HTTP and a profile for HTTPS, and we've got one for IIS as well. And we don't need any of this stuff in here. We need one profile, and it's helpful when building a microservices application to have control over what the URL is and the port that we start our application on. So I'm going to remove the IIS settings. We're not going to use IIS for this. We want our application to start on a very specific port, so we know what it is, and when we create other services, they are also given ports that we can easily remember and use. We're not going to have a launch URL because we're going to turn off the browser launching. We're not creating a web application here. We're creating a web API, so we don't need our browser to test our API. The application URL I'm going to set to HTTP localhost 7001. Please do not use HTTPS for what we're developing at this stage. I'll explain why as we build our application, but we really do want everything to run over HTTP for the most part. And as we delve into the architecture, I'll explain why that is. And we'll also take away the HTTPS profile, so let's remove that, and we'll take away the IIS Express profile as well. Please don't worry about the usage of HTTP. It will become clear later on about how we handle using HTTPS with our application, but we don't need to worry about services that we're creating now, and we're just developing these at the moment, so nobody's going to break into our computer unless they're physically here or on our network to go and access this stuff, but it's localhost as well, so this is just running on our machine. Okay, next up we'll go to our controllers, and we're just going to delete the weather forecast controller. We're not going to keep any of the demo code, and just hit the delete button and remove that from our application. Now we've got appsettings.json and appsettingsdevelopment.json. These provide configuration settings for our project, and this appsettings.json, this is loaded whatever environment we're running in, whether we're running in development or production or something else. This configuration file is always loaded and read from. And then we have some environment specific configuration files, and this one, clearly this one is for development and is only read from when we're running our application in development mode. Now typically I like to get a bit more information when running in this mode, so I'll swap the warning here for information, and this is helpful because it gives us details about the database queries that we're making when we use Entity Framework to make a query to our database. So we'll leave that as information or set it to information. Finally we get to our program class, and we've got a few errors here because we removed Swagger. But we're going to remove this configuration from here anyway. So we've got our web application creation at the top here. This gives us a builder, and then we've got a couple of sections. One is to add services, and the other is to configure the HTTP request pipeline. So any services we add are going to go in this particular section, although like I said, I'm going to remove the Swagger configuration. We need to keep the add controllers because this provides the services that we need when creating a web API controller, and then we go ahead and build our application. Now when a request comes into one of our API controllers, it goes through something called an HTTP request pipeline. This gives us the option to add software or middleware which can then affect or do something with that request in some way as it comes into our API server and goes out of our API server. Typically we'd use this for authentication and authorization, middleware we would add so it can inspect the request to see if it meets our authorization requirements. Identity is coming up further down the line in this course, so we'll not worry about identity for now, but we will remove the Swagger configuration inside here. We don't need that, and because we're running our app over HTTP, we do not need HTTPS redirection either, so we'll remove that as well. And whilst we're not touching authorization yet, we will do later, so I'm just going to leave that in place as it is. Then we've got the middleware to map the controllers. Each one of our API controllers is going to have a root, and this middleware allows the framework to direct the HTTP request to the correct API endpoint. And then finally, we run our application. I'm just going to delete the weatherforecast.cs. We do not need that either, so that can go. And now we're in a position to run our application. So we can do this a couple of ways. We can open up the terminal, and I used a shortcut key to do so, which in my case is Control and apostrophe. But if you're ever not sure about a shortcut key and you're using VS Code, then you can just come into Code, go into Settings, go into Keyboard Shortcuts, and if I was to search for terminal and toggle, then this gives me the information about which key, shortcut key combination, is currently binded for viewing the terminal, which in my case is Control apostrophe. So please do double check in here if you're ever not sure about what keyboard shortcut you are attempting to use, then you can get that information inside here. So typically I like to use the terminal to run the application, but there are other options. Now that we've got this Solution Explorer view, we could technically right-click, say Debug, and start without debugging, as an example, or start a new instance with debugging, I presume. But I don't like to use that. I prefer to just use the terminal. So you'll often see me coming into the terminal. I'm just going to cd into the source and the auction service, and I'm just going to execute .NET watch. And this is going to start our application and also attach a file watcher, so it's going to pick up any changes we make into our code and then either try and hot reload our application, which works sometimes, or typically it's going to ask us if we want to restart our application because we've made a change which hot reload does not support. So we've got our application started. We can see it's listing on localhost 7001. We can see we're running in development mode, and we can see that we can press Control and C to shut down our application. And everything looks good. Don't worry about this warning about missing application parts. We don't have an API controller, and we've got the API controller middleware loaded in our application. We're going to be adding controllers soon. As long as you see this, we're good to move forward. And what we'll take a look at next is creating the entity classes we need for our application.